rightly pointed out, my presentation will focus on the human rights implications of merging humans and AI. I'm aware from the program of this conference that previous speakers have been focusing very much on the ethics and the ethical and legal implications of neurotechnology. My presentation will try to consider what happens when we embed artificial intelligence into neurotechnology and their capabilities. Just a brief conceptual distinction between artificial intelligence and what we can call natural intelligence, or the intelligence of biological systems. Natural intelligence is the cognitive processing implemented by neurobiological systems, such as, for example, the human brain. And it has some peculiar features. First of all, it involves the ability to imagine, anticipate, feel, and judge changing situations. And this ability seems to be quite effective even in scenarios where we have a poverty of input data. This is the pro, but the con of natural intelligence is that it deteriorates over time through a process known as aging, and it is medium dependent. So to our knowledge, we cannot transfer cognitive processing from one brain to another. So when that one single brain decays, then the cognitive processing implemented by that brain decays as well. In contrast, artificial intelligence is the cognitive processing implemented by machines, such as computers. Unlike natural intelligence, it is only responsive to the input data available. So if there is a poverty of input data, then there is this will negatively affect the processing significantly. But unlike natural intelligence, the pro is that it improves over time. Especially an approach to artificial intelligence known as machine learning tends to improve constantly over time with increased amount of time for training. And it is medium independent. So there is a greater degree of transferability. It is in principle possible to transfer the processing from one AI software to a different medium, so to a different hardware. Now, let's think about the possible ways of these two kinds of intelligences to interact. And one way that has been often heralded in the media as revolutionary is the possibility that artificial intelligence will one day outsmart natural intelligence and take over and replace human intelligence. And a lot of has been written on this topic. For example, Nick Bostrom's book on superintelligence. But in recent years, cognitive scientists and philosophers started thinking about a different way to conceptualize artificial intelligence that focuses on AI's assistive role, and emphasizes the fact that AI is designed to enhance human intelligence rather to replace it. And the resulting conceptual understanding of AI has been called augmented intelligence. And we can define it as the use of AI to supplement, complement, or augment the cognitive abilities of the human brain, be it the healthy or the impaired human brain. So the various applications of augmented intelligence in the field of neurotechnology can be clustered into four main groups. One is cognitive assistance. This is an application that has been of particular interest in the field of elderly and dementia care. With my colleagues Fabrice Jotterand, Tenzin Bagmo, and Bernice Elger, we recently published a book on this topic. Based on our studies, previous studies on the topic, we found in a 2016 review that there are plenty of uses of AI as cognitive assistance for people with age-related cognitive decline that are designed to help them in the completion of activities of daily living, as well as for purposes such as cognitive monitoring, cognitive assistance, physical assistance, and social interaction. Another interesting field where augmented intelligence is emerging, so where we see biological and artificial intelligence combined, is the field of verbal communication, where artificial intelligence is being increasingly used to decode cortical signals from the brain with explicit representations of the articulatory dynamics of verbal speech in order to synthesize audible speech from brain activity. This approach has been useful, has been explored with high density electrocorticography data, but approaches based on different data types are occurring. So a lot of these applications of AI to neurotechnology fall under the umbrella term of brain-computer interfacing, which is any neuroinformatics system that establishes a direct connection pathway between the human brain and an external computing device, bypassing the peripheral and neuromuscular system. So BCI systems, as you can see in this graphic representation, acquire brain signals in a variety of data modes. Then they analyze this data and translate them into commands that are relayed to an output to carry out a desired action. And in these intermediary phases of feature extraction and classification, artificial intelligence in the form of neural networks is typically involved. A third domain of application is neuromodulation for memory enhancement. So AI is helping out in creating closed-loop neurostimulation systems that can increase cognitive performance in people whose cognitive performance is declined. This is a study based on improving memory function through neurostimulation in neurosurgical patients. This is another study that applied the same logic to cognitively healthy people in different age groups. And the researchers were able to use neurostimulation to allow people in an older age group to achieve a similar degree of cognitive performance at memory tasks as a younger population group. And then finally, the last domain of application of AI in neurotechnology is data analysis. Here, an approach to AI known as deep learning is proven to be particularly useful in making sense of brain signals, especially electroencephalography data, due to its capacity to learn good representations from raw data. So all these trends that are summarized here, and there could be more, so I made a selection of the 4 main areas of application, is a realization of a prophecy that was made very early in the early days of computer science, in the early 1960s, by one of the fathers of modern computer science, G.C.R. Licklider, who argued in 1960 in a paper prophetically entitled Man-Computer Symbiosis, that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. Now, 61 years later, we do see a number of companies, most notably Neuralink, that advertise their products as a way to connect the human brain to AI. And this merge between human and artificial intelligence seems to be of great interest for the neurotechnology and AI industry. And from a philosophical and cognitive psychological perspective, a very interesting question is about whether these applications of augmented intelligence described before qualify as mere cognitive outsourcing, which is the main way we use AI today. So as an external cognitive assistant. So for example, when we use AI-based voice assistants on our smartphones, like Siri or Cortana, that's a typical form of cognitive outsourcing. You're just outsourcing to the AI tasks that are normally implemented within the biological brain. The possibility here is that with augmented intelligence, we're moving from cognitive outsourcing to cognitive transformation, which is something way more radical, which involves AI changing the operations and representations that we use to think. So in the light of these trends, I would argue there are two complementary tasks that need to be fulfilled. One is the task of science, which is developing safer, more performative and reliable systems to sense, assist, and augment human cognitive capabilities via AI. But the corresponding task of ethics and law, I would say more broadly, is determining under which conditions it is ethical and legitimate to sense, assist, and augment human capabilities via AI. So the good news is that in order to address these two tasks, we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to start from zero. There are two established disciplines in two different domains of applied ethics that are concerned with questions of this kind. One is the neuroethics community, which is concerned with developing ethical rules for brain interventions. The other is the ethics of AI community, or AI ethics community, that is concerned with the development of ethical rules for AI systems. The problem is, however, that these two communities, historically observed, have been communicated rarely, if anything, and what we're missing here is the development of a unified ethical framework for the human AI continuum. And this creation of a unified framework is particularly relevant for brain-computer interfaces because there is a risk that otherwise, when we create this closed-loop AI powered brain-computer interfaces that create a cognitive continuum between the artificial and the biological components of the operator's brain, then we have a discrepancy in the normative principles that apply to this continuum. A notable example is the right to explanation, which is a right that has been increasingly considered in relation to artificial intelligence. It's basically the right to be given an explanation for an output of an algorithm. So a causal explanation of how, or a logical explanation of how an AI algorithm reaches a certain decision. But notably, we do not require human brains to meet the same standards. So we don't require human decision making to provide a causal neurobiological explanation of the mechanisms that led to a certain decision. So if we have a discrepancy in our normative requirements that apply to the biological and to the artificial components of cognitive continuum of brains and machines, then this could lead to confusion. A good news is, however, that many intergovernmental science and technology policy organizations, such as the OECD, are trying to pair their soft law instruments on AI with those on neurotechnology. And I had the privilege of contributing to the recommendation of responsible innovation in AI and in neurotechnology. And this recommendation has been developed in close alignment with the recommendation on AI. But so in the light of this, the second pressing ethical question here is, should we use AI to augment and support human capabilities? So provided that we have that our augmented intelligence is happening, I think this is a non-trivial conceptual question to determine whether we should pursue this at all. And I think there are two main arguments in favor. So two main arguments why we should use AI to augment human capabilities. And the first argument is an epistemic one, which has been elegantly put by Shimon Ullman, who has observed that using neuroscience to develop artificial intelligence is particularly useful from a epistemic perspective, because it is allowing us to improve our understanding of the human brain. But at the same time, he noted that improving at the same time we are improving AI through a better understanding of the human brain, especially approaches, so-called neuromorphic approaches to artificial intelligence, those that are inspired by the biological functioning of the biological brain, seem to lead to great results, especially deep learning. The approach that I mentioned earlier is one of those brain-inspired approaches. So as you can see, the relationship between neuroscience and artificial intelligence is a bidirectional one. Each discipline is contributing to the progress and development of the other discipline. And a second argument is a utilitarian argument, and it's based on the fact that neurological disorders, so disorders of the brain, but more broadly, we could say neurological and psychiatric disorders, are a major component of the global burden of disease. And unfortunately, we cannot cure what we cannot measure. So we do need to collect and analyze at high velocity data about the human brain and mind in order to develop better and more calibrated solutions for people in need. So delaying the development of augmented intelligence is not an ethically neutral stance, but something that could have detrimental consequences for hundreds of millions of people in suffering from these disorders of the mind and brain. But so provided that there is at least prima facie legitimacy in pursuing augmented intelligence, the second fundamental normative question is under which conditions we should do so. And again, this is not a trivial question, especially in the light of the fact that there is reportedly very little interest in the general population to engage in this human AI merge. Pew Research survey from a few years ago reported that brain implants to improve memory capacity or mental capacity in general, so similar to the neuromodulation approaches that I showed you earlier, are among the approaches to the AI that are the least appreciated by the general population, with 72% arguing that this is something that should not be pursued, at least that they would not pursue, compared to half-half as in relation to driverless cars, for example. So also in the light of this opposition of the general population, I would argue that we have to be very careful with the way we implement augmented intelligence. And in particular, for the purposes of today's presentation, I will highlight three main normative requirements that could help us navigate safely the implementation of augmented intelligence. These being cognitive liberty, mental privacy, and the principles of fairness and distributive justice. So let me start with cognitive liberty. So people who attended this workshop and who have some familiarity with the NeuroRights debate are certainly aware that this normative principle has been described as the freedom of an individual to control their own mental processes, cognition, and consciousnness. And it has also been relabeled as a right to mental self-determination. And cognitive liberty has been widely heralded as a utilizable concept when it comes to limiting coercive uses or compelled uses of neurotechnology, such as, for example, in the workplace, like what is happening in high responsibility jobs in China in the public sector. But it's also interesting to reflect on whether cognitive liberty could help us determine under which conditions it is ethically acceptable to embed AI capabilities into neurotechnology. And this is a question that is particularly relevant to a subtype of brain-computer interfacing technology known as neuroadaptive BCI, which is a BCI which automatically adapts to their specific aspects of their operator's mindset without any explicit input by the operator. And a few colleagues have already written about this a few years ago. For example, there's a commentary policy forum in Science from a few years ago with many neuroethicists and neuroscientists on board, argued that we should include because of the inclusion of more and more autonomous components into BCIs, and assuming that this leads to what we called earlier cognitive transformation, so that transforms the operation of the BCI into an endeavor of shared control, then they propose that this autonomous or semi-autonomous systems should include a form of veto control in order to limit the capabilities of AI features in the neural interface. Another ethical or normative principle that is relevant here is mental privacy, which has been defined by Roberto Andorno and myself as the right and ability of people to exercise control over their mental information, so determine for themselves when they want to seclude or share information about their minds. And this is a subright of privacy rights, which focuses on one specific type of information, which can be called mental information, which is a very peculiar type of information, since it includes unexecuted action and unspoken speech, so unacted behavior, and typically it eludes conscious control, and it's not in a read-only format, but as we have seen earlier with neuromodulation, it's in a read and write format. And it's important here to draw a distinction, a conceptual distinction between mental privacy and neuroprivacy. I'll get into a second, because and in order to appreciate this distinction, we need to draw a distinction between brain data and mental information. So brain data are the individual raw measurements of human brain structure, activity, and or function that still need to be processed. So when we collect electroencephalography data, that's the raw brain data. In order to make inferences about mental states and therefore generate mental information, this data need to be processed, organized, and organized in a way that collectively carries a logical meaning, so that it can reveal aspects of mental states such as thoughts, memories, and emotions. And for those who know a bit about the ethics of neuroscience, mental privacy debates go back to that old debate about so-called mind reading, which is a debate that unfolded at the beginning of this century, when some neuroscientists argued that due to advances in fMRI and pattern recognition, it is now possible to read out, I quote here John Dylan Haynes, very detailed contents of a person's thoughts. This debate then faced some controversy, because many other experts argued that fMRI techniques are not capable of reading the contents of mental states, as John Dylan Haynes argued, but only the representations or the vectors of those mental states. And also fMRI studies have been subject to the so-called replicability crisis, with many of the studies not being able to replicate. But in recent years, AI is revamping this debate, primarily because of two features, two socio-technical trends, we can call them. One is the ubiquity of mental data, and the other one is the use of AI for decoding. Now, the ubiquity of mental data is a consequence of embedding AI capabilities for reading brain data or other data types in order to infer mental information, and embedding these capabilities in a large variety of digital devices, including digital health devices, but also digital technologies for non-health related personalized use. And this is raising privacy challenges because, as we have observed in an article written with Pim Haselager and Zeke Emanuel, many of these neurotechnologies for personalized use exploit unsecure data sharing channels, and they do so in absence of oversight, either be it so professional supervision or RB oversight. AI decoding is the second reason why the brain reading debate is being revamped in recent years. And this is primarily because AI is enabling a new kind of inference that can be drawn from brain data. So the typical inference that was used by neuroscience study, especially cognitive neuroscience studies historically, is the so-called forward inference, which involves manipulating a specific psychological function to identify the localized effects of that manipulation on brain activity. But now with AI, we can do what Russ Poldrack has called reverse inference, which is sort of a form of backward reasoning, where we reason backwards from patterns of data, for example, data about neural activation, but it can be different sources of data, to infer the engagement of specific mental processes. So this is, for example, what the lab of Jack Gallant at the University of California, Berkeley is doing, where they conducted several studies in which they proved that they were able to reconstruct the semantic content or visual content of mental states from patterns of brain data. Here you see two studies of Jack Gallant's lab, one based on reconstructing visual features and the other one based on reconstructing an architecture of semantic features. So what we can say is that with AI features today allow us to reveal privacy sensitive statistical correlations between certain data aggregations and certain mental states. And this is something that is already possible today. And we can call this a mind reading in the broad sense. It's still questionable whether AI features can lead us to decode the content of mental states, the full content of mental states from brain reading, which is what a mind reading in the narrow sense would entail. And I mentioned earlier another conceptual distinction, which I think it's important here, is between neuroprivacy and mental privacy. This distinction is important because not all privacy challenges about the brain have to do with mental features or with mental information. So for example, if you take neuroimaging biomarkers of neuropsychiatric disorders, such as in this case, neuroimaging biomarkers of schizophrenia, this is a privacy sensitive type of information, which could lead to very detrimental consequences for the data subject if this information falls into the wrong hands. But this information does not encode anything related to mental information in the strict sense. In contrast, you can have mental privacy challenges that do not involve brain data. So for example, approaches to AI such as affective computing or emotion AI may use data that have nothing to do with brain recordings, such as natural language processing data, eye tracking, facial expressions, and so on. But they can analyze this data and process them in a manner that detects and analyzes affective mental states. And then the final normative principle that I want to discuss is the principle of distributed justice for augmented intelligence, especially when it comes to enhancing the internal cognitive capabilities of the human brain. I would argue it's very important to ensure fair access to and a socially just allocation of the benefits of augmented intelligence. And one way to do so is to prioritize the worse off, such as neurological patients, senior citizens, as well as people with cognitive disorders. And the rationale behind that is that AI should not aggravate current socioeconomic or geographical inequalities, but seek to mitigate them, especially in the light of the fact that, as people in public health well know, intelligence is and cognitive performance are predictors of health. So they are direct predictors of health literacy, which in turn is a direct predictor of health outcomes and longevity. So if we create augmented intelligence that is afforded only by a small number of people, then there is a concrete risk that this will aggravate inequality instead of mitigating it, and that will also aggravate health inequalities. And then just to conclude, what kind of governance approach is well suited to address the problems described here in relation to augmented intelligence? I would argue the best approach is what policy analysts call the adaptive governance approach, because it's very unlikely that a one-size-fits-all approach will be effective, but rather we need to pursue a stepwise learning under conditions of knowledge uncertainty, since we are gathering only now the relevant data about augmented intelligence. And so we need to have an iterative regulatory evaluation. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hand it over to Fruzsina.
Thanks very much, Marcello. That was great. Fruzsina, are you ready to respond now? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I am going to speak without slides, and thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to make this comment to Marcello's presentation. I will focus in my complementary comments on 3 aspects of the talk: the rights affected, the accountability issue, and the governance. Please consider, while I'm talking particularly about the accountability issue, that I have been trained in a continental law country, but I will phrase my thoughts more broadly, possibly. So the AI intervention and setting the stage. AI tools in neurotechnology can contribute to persons' empowerment in various contexts, as we have heard, and make significant contribution towards allowing persons to experience a degree of autonomy, freedom of action, integrity and dignity that would be unconceivable without these tools. Just think about the medical context and the examples we've heard. However, the application of such tools can also have restrictive effects on autonomy. They can limit the person's informational basis to make free and informed decisions. Now, the risk that machine learn-based systems might even directly restrict choices and in this way manipulate persons must be weighed against their self-determination. Besides calculations about risks, which will be a returning issue in my talk, influenced by an AI system, such concerns may arise in cases where, for instance, a semi-autonomous intelligence system is granted decision-making power based on evolving an adaptive algorithm, such as when intelligent closed-loop devices actively interfere with the state of the brain. Now, while genomic information and information derived from its combination with other health data are difficult to clarify and to explain, thus remaining as information that the person cannot directly experience and reflect upon, brain-related data increases difficulties around this perception by persons, as this is often produced on an unconscious level. Now, the result of brain-related data processing can greatly influence the future behavior of the person concerned, and in addition, it becomes more difficult to position the person affected by a neuro tool, for instance, a brain-computer interface, with regard to contentiously running information processes and their results as a whole, if it is unclear which parts of perception are due to their own brain activity and which parts are the result of brain stimulating processing by, for instance, an algorithm. Now, the processing of brain-related data could thus ultimately have an effect on the person's relationship to themselves through dynamic interactions between a person and an intelligent neurotechnological device. This may have a transformative effect on the sense of agency and the active self, including ethical constraints around identity and its connection to decision-making. Such constraints on self-determination can serve as an example to demonstrate competing rights and interests of the person in relation to the same data processing. Negative liberty, for example, the freedom from unwanted interferences with one's mental states or cognitive capacities by others, and the positive freedom to fully realize one's own cognitive capacities, including through medical treatment and care in the health sector. So the further interpretation of cognitive liberty, and even more the interpretation of mental privacy as a moral right, but also as legal rights, can benefit from focusing on their positive and negative dimensions, both resulting from formal and active freedom. Formal in the sense, when it comes to privacy, of a means of demarcation of the self, and active in the sense of a self-determined allocation to private or public areas of the person. Now, particularly as an active freedom, if we stick with privacy, privacy relies on the conscious decision-making of the affected person as a prerequisite for the implementation of the formal and active freedom. However, individual rights that detail the implementation of such a freedom by the affected person encounter unexpected difficulties exactly in relation to the conditions of conscious decision-making. One example is the right to be forgotten, touching upon data related to the human mind. The concept of forgetting gains external and internal importance due to the close proximity of these data to the data subjects and their identity. Due to the often unconscious production of such data, it is increasingly difficult to distinguish which data served as the basis for decision-making by others, including tools with regard to the data subject, and which data were returned to the data subject in some form and were thus included in the structure of their decision-making. Hereby, the connection between one's own and others' forgetting, and thus the bond between internal and relational privacy, also as manifestations of negative and positive freedom of the development of personality, cannot be overlooked. So this brings me to the second point. Transparency and accountability are cornerstones of the just application of AI and neurotechnologies. Difficulties related to the explainability of AI results create problems for validating the output of AI systems. Although AI applications have the potential to reduce human bias and error, they can also reproduce and reinforce biases, as we've heard, in the data used to train them. Concerns have also raised about the potential of AI to lead to discrimination in ways that may be hidden. And altogether, as correctly emphasized by Marcello, data quality and data diversity emerge as highly significant values associated with the development of AI tools with regard to brain-related data. And in this regard, it is vital to guide the implementation of AI by defining clear norms of accountability, as they can contribute to fair compensation in the event of harm. So AI-based applications pose challenges to the liability regulations that link to their development and use. The concrete challenges lie in the general controllability, as well as in the individual and social handling of AI systems. The interconnectedness of actors and actions in the development and application process of AI systems should be emphasized. The resulting multi-causality and indirect causality between results and actions, as well as their interaction with the autonomous properties of an AI system, well, these also contribute significantly to the lack of explainability of the results of such a system. Now, this lack of explainability in turn prevents a clear attribution of decisions and results very often, and it is often not possible to clarify whether there is a causal relationship at all between the damage caused and an action or actions, and if so, what form this takes. So, when it comes to self-learning properties of AI systems, they give rise, in this sense, to novel risk, depending on their precise degree of freedom, which should be determined how to deal with. The approaches to liability law in the jurisprudential literature attempt to address the lack of explainability of AI-based results and the self-learning properties, either by constructing attribution or imputability, or by waiving the requirement of attribution or imputability, and thus also that of causality. Now, the aim of liability law regulations is to create compensation for disadvantages suffered and to prevent damaging behavior. And the relationship between the compensatory and the preventive functions of liability law are strongly disputed with regard to AI systems. The compensatory function of such laws provisions is aimed to achieving the purpose of legal protection by restoring the injured right with compensation for damage. Through the principle of compensation and the disadvantage thereby imposed on compensating parties, they will direct their conduct towards minimizing this disadvantage and, if possible, avoiding it altogether. And if the minimization or avoidance of the disadvantage can be achieved by a certain conduct, then those obliged to compensate will shape their conduct accordingly, carefully, in order to avoid liability due to fault, for instance, as far as possible. However, the principle of prevention can also be ascertained in the context of strict liability, which is also discussed in the context of AI applications, because when performing dangerous or hazardous activities, the aim is to minimize the risk of liability and to prevent the occurrence of damage, and it can thus be stated that the preventive function is closely linked to the compensatory function of liability law and can be derived from it in a way that is in a sense of behavior and conduct management. I will come to the third point, quality and equity, which will lead me to the final thoughts. New neurotechnological tools fuel discussions also about these two principles, equality and equity. We've heard about just and distributive principles in the talk. And both of these further principles strongly relate to the challenges raised by diverse types of biases through these tools, the connecting obligation of non-discrimination and just application, and the elimination of disparities in different applications. As new neurotechnological tools are implemented, for instance, in care, inequalities and equity challenges regarding benefit sharing from the application of these technologies due to costs, access burdens, and the disease, as well as individualized and stratified context specificity of the technologies and software, will play a crucial role and need to be considered when defining obligations related to their development and application. On the other hand, there are measures of empowerment and public engagement that must increasingly focus on developing and reinforcing the competencies of those affected by these technologies, as well as preparing, designing, and conducting public involvement also and commitment on participatory levels of deliberation when it relates to decision-making. In a way, throughout all these issues, an elementary cornerstone of conduct will remain the risk assessment of these technologies. And when making this risk assessment for the application of a neurotechnology, the way data is dealt with, the way the processing affects persons will be decisive. So in other publications, Marcello has also stated that there is ground and need to think about how we are exactly dealing with the data that we process, and it's less about what is exactly being processed. It's the way of implementing, of designing, of applying all these technologies. Which leads me to the final thoughts that the risks and benefits will ultimately remain contextual. However, the adequate response to them will always be relational with regard to human and fundamental rights. I thank you very much for your kind attention and happy to start the discussion.